titled Asking the Right Questions, Community Respect and Safety. And the reason that the organizers of this meeting have included this is that the classical ethical principles that we are familiar with that guide our work, either as contributing research studies for ethical consideration or sitting on REBs and OREs, is that they do not necessarily foreground community respect and safety. And as you listen to today's session, perhaps ask yourself, what can be suggested to REBs and OREs in terms of what they should be looking out for to assess whether applications presented to them are appropriately articulating how to achieve community respect and safety. So perhaps just bear that in mind as we move through today. So essentially, in introducing each of the speakers, who will speak for 15 minutes each, approximately, and I will then allow a 5-minute period for anyone to ask questions of clarification and just get a better sense of what the speakers were presenting before we complete the round of presentations and move into a plenary discussion. We also talked about possibly that we have 5 speakers today and a long session, 2.5 hours. And so we're going to have a short stretch break probably after 3 of the speakers. So welcome, presenters. It's an honor to moderate the session, privileged to be with you. And to hear about the wonderful work you've all been doing and the insights that you will share with us today. Essentially, my invitation to you is to talk about what you have been doing in the work that you do, either in your research or teaching or whatever, but to talk about the work that you have been doing to achieve community respect and safety. What have you done to actually achieve these important outcomes? So I'm going to begin with Dr. Caroline Saunders, who is an associate professor and coordinator of the graduate programs in the School of Nursing at UNBC. And just reiterate a little bit about Caroline. Her research interests stem from her long-standing nursing career in the UK and lie in applied methods focused on rare conditions across the lifespan, specifically intersex, as well as research focused on early childhood with vulnerable populations. She served in a range of roles within the university and is presently the acting chair. Her connections with the wider community continue to grow, and she values her work in primary care, where she can maintain clinical skills in practice and focus on building partnerships with families and providers. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much. I would just like to ask Rachel to pop my slides up. There are only 6, so please do take a breath. It's not going to be too many slides. Thank you. So I would just like to do my land acknowledgement. I'm coming today from the ancestral and unceded territory in the of the Lake Leighton people up in Prince George. And it is a day where we have stopped raining. For those that I notice on the call who are also living in the north, we do have sunshine from time to time, but the mosquitoes are heavy. So I'm glad I've turned my camera off for a minute. There are several of them in this room and they're driving me crackers. It's a great privilege to be here today, and I know that we all believe that research is important. And through the lens of society, we do hear questions about its value, the length of time it takes, and the moral and social landscape that it inhibits. So as we've heard, my background is as a children's nurse, and I've worked in the UK for more than 30 years clinically in the area of paediatric surgery, and I've specialised in paediatric urology and gynecology, specifically working with families whereby a child was born with sex variation. Further, I worked with many children with complex physical challenges who were living their lives within their families and after they left their families. And that resulted in needs for those children to have additional support needs, often in their personal care in infancy and throughout childhood. Since coming to Canada, I do work in primary care with more marginalised populations, and I'm part of the work that we're leading in the North focused on the early years, and we're trying to bring education, health and social care and families together as part of our SEED network. So more recently, we've completed some longitudinal studies with families with children aged 0 to 8 years during the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please, Rachel. So my goal is to talk a little bit about experience and really what is the family voice in REB. So family-focused studies and family-led interventions, parent advocacy boards, family impact, if we think about family-focused policies or programs and what is enacted, as well as family-centered practices and how policies or programs are implemented, is really quite complex. However we may decide to define family, that's not what I'm here to do today. Principles of responsibility, stability, relationship, diversity, engagement are among the critical factors that we may study. But how are such principles translated to narrative and work at the level and importance of REB boards specifically? So I'm going to take an example from practice. So as an RN working in community, I listen to families as part of my clinical life. They shared their worries about COVID, the social media fears, and the ask of, well, who's really listening to us when we have younger children and we're at home all the time? Please don't send me a survey. I don't have time to tick a box that doesn't change things for me and my reality. The research and the clinical space are grey areas in that how we are not listening to stories means that it's how we won't be doing our research. And actually then we're not curious about the things that can often matter to families. We don't research our populations as clinicians. That's an ethical debate in and of itself. However, even when they're asked, and we're asked by our communities to be able to do research with them, there is a tense and a grey space. Again, it's complex. So what happened for us was that we had a small grant project here with families who had told us what they wanted to hear. And what we had was the children under the age of 5 living in Prince George, because that's where I'm from. And we wanted our study team to be able to reach out to a different set of families, being informed by the families that we'd heard from in clinical practice. So as a study team, how do we ask parents with busy lives and families in busy lives, not just parents, paying attention to time constraints and varying levels of literacy and their busy lives and busy day-to-day activities? So we developed a suite of approaches to collect data. Real time, providing tablets as technology. We decided to use photo, voice, emails, text messaging, all informed by what we'd heard in practice. We were challenged by our own REB with a position that we were asking too much of already stressed families. I asked, how did they know this? Were they sat in practice with me? Did they come to my clinic with me? And had they heard the same stories as me? And whose voice was important? Those families that I'd heard from the clinical world who had asked for this as their process to research, their pieces, their voice, were now being neglected and negated. So the research team was really just the conduit to develop something that could be helpful. And each time we were asked by our REB to further justify and explain the ways we wished to undertake this study, we offered increasingly detailed positions as to why this may work as research, as a research approach. Meanwhile, we knew families were still waiting to be heard. There is always that liminal time in which we make people wait. We did get sign-off from REB and we did do the study. And just out of interest, within the first weekend of recruitment, we had 85 families wish to sign up. Next slide, please, Rachel. I also wanted to talk about compensation because it fitted in with that study, but also previous studies too. It's a very slippy slope. So do REBs reflect on the increase in the cost of living? And how do we keep pace with this when on our research world when we're having conversations with families? So we were thinking about our COVID study and compensation model. And we had a tablet as part of the ask. The families had said, hey, we've got older children who can't access the school curriculum because we don't have technology in our house. So we decided to use the tablet in the study with the COVID population of younger age children to be able to provide them with a resource that they could then keep as compensation. Or we would give them compensation that was equivocal, which was $150. The REB was very unhappy with our $150 ask because it was seen as coercive. We broke down the time frame as we were collecting data over a period of 6 weeks. We compared it to the minimum wage, and we are still selling families short. At the end, some families kept the tablet as they had limited access to electronics, as I say. It helped older children. And for others, they took the voucher because they wanted to do a grocery shop. So my question is, with 3 or 4 children in a family, can you do a grocery shop on $150 for a week? What we also heard was a plea from families, please don't stop the study. So how do we take this voice from families and actually translate that in a way to be able to continue a study? So they were not ready to stop. They wanted to continue to share. So we had to find a way to keep going. The compensation changed because we had no funding, but we had to manage to maintain the study. We had to become really creative. We heard it was never about the voucher as we then connected back with these families. It was nice, but the fact that they had a space to have a voice was much more critical. We honored that in giving back to the families by developing a memory book that was a compilation of all the anonymized images, poems, and stories that the families had collected as this longitudinal piece of work during the times of COVID and what it meant for them in their early years. Next slide, please, Rachel. So in empirical and qualitative studies of family life, the researcher and being a clinical provider or even clinical historian inevitably becomes embedded in the personal worlds of families. We can't escape that. We're naive if we think we can. Spending time reading and reflecting on research and thinking about the ways in which we change or shift needs to happen while living in a world of constraints is difficult for what we see as researchers, what we understand as clinicians, and what families are actually enduring. So such ethical and epistemological debates are warranted, but where does that actually leave families? I ask about PIs based on much of my work in UK and Europe. The population of parents with children born from sex variation, differences in sex development or intersex, have globally formed many networks, support groups and advocacy groups, as well as strong activism-focused parties, shall we say. Working with families and adults who now have had their own families, I learned that peer groups wanted to guide research. They wanted to ask the questions that had meaning to them across all stages of their lives. So such groups want to develop and lead research, have accountability and autonomy in actually becoming the research leaders. And in fact, some do. They bend our current process by which we only afford this opportunity, in my experience, by entering healthcare professions as providers. So many of those I've worked with have become physicians or nurses or social workers in some way to be able to undertake research in this area. What I do know as a panel member on our DSD Families Global Network is the fact that actually networks like that would love to do the research, but they're bound by the ways we typically currently do research in the fact that they're not allowed to be able to do this and be the champions and leaders. So the studies of families and relationships, children's lives and parental decision-making is also complex in this historical area that I've worked in. It's largely informed from a feminist standpoint, shaped by the ethics of care. The vulnerability of such groups is well reported in the literature, and the intrusion of research into family lives and maintaining privacy is critical. So working with a formalized process of ethics and standards and codes of practice is possible, while at each turn being an opportunity to reflect and plan as best as we can for how we might make decisions, draw on the ethical principles and act with integrity. Where there is increased sensitivity and discussions with an ethicist can be really helpful is when actually there are significant challenges within how we are currently practicing our standards of care. And we need to determine what the difference is between risk in distress and risk in harm. And I'm not sure we're always very clear on that. That's critical within the world of intersex as we talk about surgical and non-surgical debate. And that's a very tempered conversation that I won't step towards today. So make sure that participants are aware of procedures, and informing and directing external agencies for support is something that we all do. And the details of a contact person outside of a research project need to be available. And they are really legitimate requests from an REB. But when undertaking family research, a critical factor to consider is the extreme difficulty in concealing individual identity within the family when we have subject and study outputs. So how do we balance a father's testimony versus a mother's testimony when they know that they share a narrative within the study? What's interesting and unplanned for an event in my PhD was very much when parents had opinions that were very different from each other, but they'd never spent time to talk to each other. So the legacy of the work that we have with families is that we can actually unintentionally cause tension in a space that was not there before. Next slide, Rachel. Thank you. So in isolation, information does not help parents. Only when it's shared, discussed, and used in practice is it useful. Only then does the information become meaningful and does it give the parent and the family the agency we want them to have from the information we're providing them with. So consent forms. One of the things we've heard from families and many different young people as we've progressed in our intersex research is count how many times you're asking for consent. It can be really easy to, and much more than you imagine, and what's the impact by the time you've asked them to consent, sometimes up to 18 times on some of the forms that we have as standard forms. So if the consent form is intended to ensure families are fully cognizant of what they're signing up to, but a standardized checklist is also an audit trail to protect the organisation from litigation, whose priority are we actually attending to? Does the process provide researchers with an artificial sense of ethical security? Families' lives are complex. There will be tensions and uncertainty in research. So how can we meaningfully address this? An REB can be helpful here, for example. So my long-standing clinical experiences may have made me less sensitive to the complex nature of research in this area. And an REB can actually remind me of the sensitivity and the risk. So I think that's a valuable lesson from an REB perspective. And last slide, Rachel. So I just want to land really on saying that family research is really messy, and there is a risk in the psychosocial qualitative studies that we do. It warrants discussion. It could be linked to trust and protection of the public as families, however we see them. Power is never removed from the interview encounter, and research skills and readiness is encouraged as a lifelong learning process. There can be a shift from the research position to what the family like about how their narratives are presented, and will that be okay? So who do we actually pay testimony to in the end of the work that we present? So the connection with the family in the presentation becomes a real concern, and there is a drive to sometimes over-clean the data to report with ambiguity because we are afraid of what we're reporting. So REBs have a space and a role in drawing attention to such complexities, to inform a researcher of the risk and to ensure that there are such potentials, that there is a need to pay attention to how we can navigate this within and support a study team. So research in areas of sensitivity with families, with those that are making intimate disclosures, or with families with varying degrees of vulnerability within them, can be seen also as politically motivating. We see this as an area, particularly in the area of sex variation and infant genital surgeries. So in such circumstances, REBs perhaps need to grow and also need to know researchers and how they can get to know researchers to afford ways in which they can actually return to provide updates to an REB and share knowledge and education in ways that allow all parties to grow and to learn and to listen. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Caroline, for that very interesting presentation. So we're running a little bit over time, but I'm going to allow 1 or 2 questions of clarification before we move on to the next speaker. So please choose to indicate either by raising your hand or putting your question in the answer in the chat box. And Terry, if you could please alert me to anyone raising hands. Any questions at all? Clarification? All right. Well, seeing none, I think we'll move on in the interest of time. So our next speaker, Dr. Ziza Dormdunu, is an assistant professor at the School of Nursing in the University of Victoria. And Zifa is a native of Dzodzé, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Zifa, in Ghana, beautiful country I've visited once before. Her recent research focuses on mental hypersensitivity and racism as predictors of patient outcomes. Zifa has co-authored book chapters and published several articles in peer-reviewed journals, as well as in turn serving as a reviewer for several journals. She's currently the president of the Coalition of African, Caribbean, and Black Nurses in British Columbia. It's wonderful to have you join us today, Zifa, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I hold no bad feelings for the spellings or the pronunciations of my name. It is quite difficult and complex. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here. Can you all see my screen? Because for some reason, everybody has disappeared from me.
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it? Okay. All right. I can't see you, but I will just continue. Sorry. So I want to thank everybody for being here and thanking the organizers for extending invitation to me to be here. I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Lachowsky people here on the Coast Salish Sea. It's actually a rather beautiful day here today, so I hope that you are having an equally beautiful day wherever you might be today. The title of my talk is "What is in a Consent?" And what I mean by this is not what is literally in a consent, but figuratively, what is in a consent. What I hope to convey to you by the end of my presentation is that currently, the way in which the consent process is conducted for patients who are getting implantable devices with metal is insufficient. It's insufficient because it does not fully disclose the inherent risks associated with putting metals in the body. I will share how I got to this particular topic a little later. But before I do that, I do want to I'm not going to embarrass myself to try and give you a talk on bioethics, but what I will do is draw our attention to the Nuremberg Code, which we all know really solidified the need for getting consent from individuals and communities, of course, and specifically says that we need to disclose the hazards that are reasonably to be expected and the effects on the person's health and wellness. This also put forward that people can actually withdraw consent at any time. So the question that I think we have to answer is, how are we operationalizing that for people getting metals put into their bodies? I use the term devices, and so I just provided a definition here. So, devices can range from anything from a Band-Aid to a fully implantable artificial heart. And what I am talking about is implants. So these are medical devices that are implanted into the body for cosmetic or life-sustaining reasons. And they do not necessarily exert their primary function through chemical reactions, but we are organic chemical entities. So there are chemical reasons or chemical processes going on that we haven't actually fully described yet. We know the devices are classified by risks, so class 1 through class 3, 3 being the highest. And when it comes to the issue of consenting, is how do we, is the question, do we need to change the consent based on the different risks, the risks that the device poses to the body? That is questions that yet to be answered. Here, I also just wanted to show that often people don't really understand how and where a metal is being implanted in the body. So I wanted to show this diagram, which is a figure from Kai-Hai, basically representing all the implantable devices that have been, procedures rather, by volume here in Canada in 2018, 2019. And as you can see, cataract surgery, knee, hip, stent lead the pack here, and all the way down to shoulder replacement surgeries. What I will say is, if not all of these procedures, that a very high percentage of them all have metals as part of the surgery and as part of the devices that are put and inserted in the body. So then the question is, what is in the consent currently? So I know all of you have seen a lot of different consent forms out there. And generally speaking, they will start off by giving the participants or the people risks that are inherently associated with the use of the device. You know, death is always number one up there. There might be some, device failure is also another one that commonly show up. There's also sections that talk about the risks that are associated with the general surgery. And so this is actually related to the procedure of the surgical procedure rather. So there's usually a list of what those risks might be. There also might be a section that talks about the potential complications of the cardiopulmonary bypass machine, if that is required as part of the surgical procedures. Again, all the risks, major risks, common risks that are associated are often listed here. Sometimes, depending on what procedure or device the person is getting, there are specific medications that they have to abide by. So sometimes they may have to be on blood thinners. So then the potential medication side effects are also included on the consent form. And then of course, it ends with a statement about this is investigational and there might be other effects that we don't actually know, predict, or can foresee. What I want to tell you is that not in my experience or that of people who are getting implants, are there ever the risks associated with putting metal in the bodies discussed. I'll tell you how I came to that in a minute, but what is metal hypersensitivity? Metal hypersensitivity is an immunological response, a type 4 to be exact, response that occurs when you put metal into the body. And what happens is metal, there's different form of corrosions, but the metal undergoes corrosion in the body. Locally, it can create localized inflammation, and that can lead to the failure of the device. But systemically, it can the ions can bind with protein in the body and bring about a lot of different signs and symptoms like pain, swelling. There's delayed wound healing. There's sometimes cutaneous eruptions of rashes, eczema, and other things. And often clinicians and in the literature, it would say that this is a rare condition, that it's a rare event. But we know that the literature has also shown us that up to about 80% of people with poorly functioning devices in their body actually have metal hypersensitivity. And so this notion that it is a rare occurrence is actually false. And it's false because the epidemiological data on this event is not complete. We don't ask, we don't know, we don't test. So because of all of those reasons, we can't actually in good faith be telling patients that these things are rare. Of course, the evidence has been here long enough that there's been a systematic and a meta-analysis done, which show that patients who have metal allergy have about 3 times the risk of getting stent restenosis. The study, of course, was from 2013, so the data might be a little bit different now, but that risk is there. My colleagues and I have also demonstrated that the notion of metal hypersensitivity has actually popped into the literature in the 1940s, and it came into the orthopedic literature around the 1960s. And as you can see, over time, there's been increased production or publications around the topic. Of course, the biomedical community also knows this, because if you look at the different package insert for these devices is clearly listed that a contraindication for use of these medical devices are allergies or hypersensitivity to the various compositions of the devices. And again, this information do not make its way into the consenting process. My colleagues and I have also demonstrated based on our own clinical practice that our healthcare workers do not actually know about metal hypersensitivity. They do not screen for this when they're seeing patients. And because they don't do any of those things, when people present to the health system with problems around metal hypersensitivity, they are often left unsupported to suffer through the process by themselves. So armed with the information that I just showed you, particularly about my own practice as a nurse, the first time I came across this particular issue was a patient in the ICU who had had a heart attack. And in talking to her, came to discover that she had an extensive allergy to metal, but that information never was asked. She never disclosed it. And when I asked her, how come you didn't tell anybody about these things? She, and I quote, said, "Nobody asked me." And close quote. The interesting thing about that question is that I know I had also asked her about allergies, but I never asked, did you or are you allergic to metal? And so I was interested in speaking to people or persons who have had this issue. And so I spoke to somebody with a lived experience, sharing my own experience as a nurse clinician and what I know from the literature. And I wanted to understand from their perspective, what information would really help them make an informed consent or make an informed decision about implants. And together, I should actually clarify that. Together, after talking about the information, came up with a question about what information would help allow people to make informed consent about implants. So we did an interpretive phenomenology study, enrolled 16 people from 5 different countries. And here is the demographic table. I will, this is just the first 10 people, just for the sake of space. I want to draw your attention to these 2 columns here, where the sex and the racial grouping. And in the people that we recruited, majority of them are female. And in the literature, what we initially saw was that, women are overrepresented in this issue. And earlier on, the reasoning was that women, based on gender roles, women were exposed to metal more so than men. And that's how and why they're sensitized. And that's why they are more likely to have metal hypersensitivity following implant. The truth of the matter is that rationale does not hold true any longer. And so it is my suspicion, and those of the participants that I spoke with, or people with lived experience, that there actually might be a sex-based differences here that we have yet to really fully explain. For those of you who might have heard me talk ad nauseum about race is not pathological, that racism is, I basically challenge us as researchers that anytime we see overrepresentation of one racial group in our research, in our work, we ought to be actually thinking the racism is actually in play here. So I had to take the same challenge myself to see how is racism playing a role in this particular situation. And the way in which I believe, and the participants agree, that racism is playing a role here is racism really informs or underpin our social positioning in society. And so in my sample, in my participants here, majority of them were identified as white. I should say some of them did not identify by racial groupings. But if you see, they were also highly educated. So many of them had graduate education at either master's or the doctoral level. There were surgeons, journalists, lawyer, professors, accountants, singers. So they were very well positioned, socially positioned people. And every single one of them talked about the heartache and the difficulty that they encounter just trying to get anybody in the health system to believe them, first of all, to listen to them about what they are experiencing after the devices, to believe them that this metal hypersensitivity is actually real and it's not some rare, unicorn type thing that never happens to people. And then to be willing to walk the journey with them to try and find some solution. And so the question that we all as a community, as the huge global community, need to be wondering is, if folks higher on that social ladder are experiencing this much difficulty in just getting help, how much more of those of us who are not socially privileged, like myself and those individuals in the study. The major findings, so all the participants said they had not received any information at all about metal hypersensitivity during the consenting process, and that they in fact came to the diagnosis through using their own means. So, searching, Googling, speaking to people, maybe talking to somebody else who's having this issue, and then doing their own research and taking that information from doctor to nurses to physiotherapists to specialists. And even then, only a handful of them were able to find a surgeon willing, or who's well-versed in this situation, willing to take the device out. And some of them did have relief after the device came out. Majority of them also noted that they weren't in fact even aware that they had issues with metal until the device went in. And when I asked them specifically about what can we do about the consenting process, a few of the comments are just telling people this can happen, even in rare condition. This is what it looks like or could look like. And if you have these reactions, here is what you can do. Another said a more clear, informed consent process that flags this to be real, and not just saying that it's rare, that it's not going to happen, and not going into a lot of details about it. Ultimately, the one thing that I wasn't aware when I started this project was just how vulnerable this people experiencing this condition are. This one quote said, "I have found myself repeatedly minimized, marginalized, and treated like a second-class citizen when I inquired about the little unknown issue." The truth of the matter is, we talk about metal hypersensitivity having physical symptoms on people, but in this research, what I've also uncovered is that there's a lot of psychological burden and suffering for the participant, with a few of them actually, because of the issues that they were facing, had at one point in their journey consider ending their own lives. They have offered a few recommendations here. I know I'm a little bit over time, but I will take time to just go over them. In terms of the consenting, they are asking us to include information about the composition of the devices in the consenting process. They want us to have a discussion with them about the metal hypersensitivity being a real potential adverse effect of the device use. They want some preoperative screening to be also part of that consent form. And in terms of the health system improvement, they're asking that when we discharge them from hospitals, to include information about metal hypersensitivity in that discharge, information to include an implant that talks about the metal composition, so that if they have issues later on, they know exactly what is in their body, what is made out of, and then they can hopefully get tested for those things. They do want to be checked in. They want somebody to at least just check in on them routinely after they have the implant, to be able to help them identify any complication that may occur. Ultimately, they're asking that we just increase our knowledge as healthcare workers, particularly those in the outpatients, about this issue. I started my talk by asking what is in a consent, and I hope I have conveyed to you that literally what is in a consent is inadequate, because it does not talk about this issue of metal hypersensitivity. But another thing that is in a consent, figuratively speaking, is trust. Trust, this is one definition of what trust is. And when we are engaging in a consenting process with our patients in our communities, really, what are we saying? That they're trusting us, that we are conveying all the possible risks associated with putting implant in their body. And when that information is not there, it does not engender trust. And so the question was, what am I doing as a researcher to achieve community respect and safety? I listened to my patient when they told me about their allergies. I went on to educate myself about what this issue is and what we could potentially do about it. And then I engaged with somebody who had actually walked this path to learn more about what it is that we can be doing as an individual and as a community members to promote the safety and respect of our community. The question of what is a community always throws me off, because I belong to a lot of different communities. But the one community that I know we all belong to, that is of the human community. So this problem does not discriminate. You are also likely to have it as much as I am, as much as these individuals. So now I readdress the question to you in that, what will you be doing now that you know in your role as ethics, the research board for the research ethics board, what would you do to achieve safety and respect of our communities? Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry that I went that a little over.
Thank you, Zifa, for that also very interesting talk and focus on consent. So again, I'd like to ask the audience to indicate any questions of clarification, and Terry and I will watch out for those. Any questions of clarification? Please keep your questions for the plenary as we move forward towards that point. All right, shy audience today. Seeing none, we'll move on. And it's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Elizabeth Saewyc, who is Professor and Distinguished University Scholar and Director of the School of Nursing at UBC. Dr. Saewyc leads the Stigma and Resilience Among Vulnerable Youth Center, whose research focuses on how stigma and trauma influence the health of marginalized young people, and what protective factors and interventions can foster resilience. Over the past 20 years, Dr. Saewyc has conducted mixed methods research with many different groups of vulnerable youth. And it is a pleasure to invite her to step up and share her thoughts with us. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Malcolm. Hello, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I live on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam people, but I do my work across a variety of different lands, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers of those lands, including places in other parts of the world, such as Eritrea or New Zealand, Australia, and parts of the lower North America in the United States, because the work that I do, that Malcolm spoke about in terms of working with young people, involves a variety of different communities, and including communities in Europe as well, and in Asia and other parts of the world, and that creates some really interesting questions in thinking about what is community, and especially when we're thinking of young people, how do we engage with respect and safety. I'm a public health nurse by background, with a clinical practice that focused on adolescent health, reproductive and mental health, and as Malcolm mentioned, working with young people who have experienced a significant amount of stigma, discrimination, and trauma. And part of our work in the research center really does involve a focus on how different marginalized groups of young people experience multiple and overlapping forms of oppression and trauma, and how that influences their health, but also what elements of their lives, their relationships, their context, policies and programs and interventions actually can help buffer that discrimination and stigma and help achieve health equity and improve their opportunities in spite of that. And to be more specific about the kinds of young people with whom I've practiced around health and nursing, but also in our research, that does include young people who are in government care, including in the justice system, but also more often in child welfare system. Youth who've experienced sexual exploitation or sexual abuse and other forms of sexual violence, youth experiencing homelessness or precarious housing, as well as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, queer, and two-spirit young people, and youth who experience racism and other forms of discrimination. So in thinking about community respect and safety, when we think about adolescence, a key principle within our center is nothing about us without us. And for us, how we enact that in our research is actually in our teams, ensuring that when we are doing specific research, members of the team are actually part of the or have lived experience as from the particular communities that we're doing the research with. But of course, most researchers are adults. And while they remember their adolescence, for some like me, that was actually a long time ago. And what's going on in young people's lives today is quite different. So we also engage youth advisories of young people from the specific communities that we do the work with. So for example, in conducting our national Canadian Trans Youth Health Survey with young people aged 14 to 25 in all the provinces and the territories, we actually mobilized trans and non-binary youth advisories in 6 of the provinces and an online one to actually reach youth who are in more rural areas as well as in the territories. And the idea of that, of course, is engaging for guidance, both in the priorities of the research and the questions, in guidance around tapping people and recruiting for the research and the way we ask the questions, but also in interpreting the results and the recommendations going forward. We also build on previous work. We're not necessarily always coming to a design and saying, right, we've got to set up all of these same things in place, because we also build on the dialogues and the conversations and the previous work that has already happened as a starting place for working with additional studies. And we constantly ask, as we're doing this work, who's not in the room, who's not part of either the sample, even who's not being part of the process, to ensure that where that's possible, we actually can include more, or that we're mindful of why we're choosing to focus on a particular group for this study, and make sure that in additional studies, we will be identifying and working and focusing on the priorities around groups who have not been in the room for previous studies. And that's for us a really key thought. Now, that doesn't mean that all research needs to be community-based participatory research processes, and that is always qualitative research. We actually in Saewyc do everything from intensive CBR research, as well as clinical research, all the way to large-scale population-based data sources or data surveys, either online or across multiple countries, including working with the health behavior of school-aged children, which is a survey that happens with 50 different countries across Europe, Asia, and includes Canada. So there still, however, are ways to include some of these strategies for nearly all designs of research, and to ensure that who's at the table in designing the research, who's at the table in conducting the research, and who's actually making sense of the findings and moving forward with mobilizing that knowledge, also are part of the communities. This can be a bit more complex sometimes when it comes to working with adolescents and young adults. But actually, I've often found over the years that it's the grown-ups that are really hard to work with. It's not necessarily the young people who come with a lot of enthusiasm and really passionate perspectives and opinions about their lived experience. And surprisingly, the number of adults in the room, including on research ethics boards, in research teams, that are a bit more paternalistic, a bit more overprotective, or not understanding the capacity of young people is an important consideration. And so for me, when I think about community respect and safety, a key part of that is actually understanding the capacity and safety of young people when it comes to research. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child actually enshrines a right of children to have a voice in things that affect their lives, and with attention to the emerging capacity of the young person developmentally. And this as a right is something that we hold to in doing our research, to also pay attention to the emerging capacity of the young person in understanding the risks, but also having a voice and the right to speak about and contribute to knowledge about their lives. And this is particularly important as we look at, navigating over adolescence. That's a major developmental time point. And an 11-year-old looks very different from a 19-year-old, although they're both adolescents technically. And so it's important to really think about that, that emerging capacity, but also especially to remember that older adolescents who are still legally minors have a very different perspective. Some of the research that we've done with young people, and I will use it as an example, the collaboration with the McCreary Centre Society, funded by the provincial government, to do the BC Adolescent Health Survey, which is a school-based survey of tens of thousands of young people in grades 7 to 12 across the province every 5 years. And school districts actually make decisions about whether the survey will be implemented with parental notification, but youth consenting and weighing the decision to participate, or whether they will require signed parental consent for youth to participate. And it's interesting because, of course, the perspective is that it's really important to protect young people and ensure that, parents are the best people to be able to provide that information and consent for them. But in our conversations and consultations with both parents and school people and young people themselves, we've actually found that students in grade 11 and 12 were insulted in school districts that decided that they were required to have signed parental consent to participate, as they said, I can consent for my own healthcare, where they ask even more invasive questions about my health and well-being than a school survey. And yet I cannot actually consent to answer these questions and choose whether or not to do so. So for us, that was a really interesting experience around thinking about respect as well as safety, and being able to convey that to our REB. It's also important to think about, especially with marginalized populations, as I said before, that we normally expect that parents have the best interests of their children and adolescents at heart, and that they're best able to protect their young person's involvement in research. And unfortunately, that isn't always the case. As I mentioned, both in clinical practice and in research, I've regularly been working with young people who experience either separation from their families and their parents. And then you have the question of parental consent if someone is in foster care, or consent if someone is actually homeless or living in a completely different city and estranged from their parents. How do you even navigate that? But also because of some parents are actually not protectors of their children and their youth. And we've seen over and over again, over the years that the center has been in place and the years that I've been doing this research, that 2S LGBTQ plus youth often have difficult circumstances around navigating safety of even disclosing their sexual orientation or their gender identity to their families. And far too often, young people have come out only to be kicked out and end up in precarious housing, or may be actually experiencing harm and abuse in that process. So there are a number of young people who access health services, who access school services and social support, where we do have legal opportunities, especially in BC. We have the Infants Act and longstanding protections in most countries around the rights of adolescents to consent for healthcare and confidentiality from parents around particular sensitive issues. And young people do have a pretty good knowledge of whether or not it's safe to disclose to their parents. Sometimes parents surprise us and surprise them and respond with an amazing joy or an, oh yeah, I know that, and I'm totally fine with that. But more often than not, when young people are terrified of disclosing, or the thought that their parents might know their sexual orientation or gender identity at this stage of their life, there's a really good reason for that. So asking sexual minority and gender diverse youth for parental consent can actually increase harm to them. In fact, disproportionate to the research that might be being done. It's often safer for them to engage in research without parental consent than requiring that consent for youth who aren't out. Now, that raises that important question about, well, why not just like work with the youth who are out and whose parents are fine with it? And the challenge, of course, there is safety is supported and protected, but the science ends up being really weakened, because more often than not, the people who most need to be heard, who have the clearest insight and important information for us in how to improve health services and programs and policies to improve health equity, are those who are not out and are not supported by their family. And so if we're only talking to the young people who are supported, we're really missing the most marginalized and vulnerable in our community, who have perhaps the greatest need of the support and services. So a key piece of this is actually thinking about how do we balance that. And there are a variety of strategies that we have undertaken over the years, in part engaging with youth in groups or places where they have trusted adults who are social service providers or teachers or school counselors or school nurses or other community outreach workers who are able to both either be with them or be able to provide a support and awareness around the issues in terms of safety and research. Much of the research we do also, we focus on weighing those issues of what are the risks. And I think Caroline mentioned it specifically in looking at the potential harms that are emotional or distress harms that may be transient or part of daily experiences, as opposed to harms that are likely to engender specific health issues, physical harms and others. Some of the work we've done with youth who have been abused, especially sexually exploited youth, have said, you know, the asking the questions, especially when you're not asking me to like recount my traumatic experiences, but just asking about my life and about me, there's a little bit of emotional distress that goes with it, but it's not that much. And the work is important. Being heard and helping other people is important. So it's also important for us to balance the protection of young people with their right to altruism and their right to actually have a voice and contribute to the process. So those are elements in thinking about it. We also, in a fair amount of the research we do, attend to the issues of consent, and the issues of thinking about how that looks truly informed with young people. And I can tell you that it does not mean using the intensely complicated language and legalese of the standard template consent forms from most REBs, which are great for lawyers, and they're really great for us university educated folks. But your typical 14-year-old is going to be going like, glaze over, and I'm not there. But we do need to actually understand and ensure that they know what they're signing up for and what that might be. So as an example, we were involved in a national randomized clinical trial of a text messaging intervention for healthy sexuality and teen pregnancy prevention among lesbian and bisexual girls across the United States. And so this required that young people would be receiving 6 to 10 text messages every day for 7 weeks. And they were about sex and about sexual behavior and about protecting yourselves in a variety of ways. And so in signing up young people and consenting them and providing that information about the study, it wasn't enough to just say, so this is what we're going to do. You okay with that? It was actually like, so what would happen if someone saw texts about these things and naming a few specific do people look over your shoulder? Do other people have access to your cell phone? How would you deal with this kind of a scenario? So having a few examples of potential ways that there might be possible harm, and their ability to think through, and then because there's a little more concrete example of possible risks, they could actually navigate that decision of, oh, well, I won't because I know this technology and I can do this to actually make it safe. Or, oh, I didn't think about that. I do have a really nosy little brother. Never mind. This is probably not the right time. So that ability to actually place it in context and make really concrete rather than really vague, long words is an important element to it. And understanding their capacity to assess the risks and respecting that is also a really important element. I will say that for most young people, the key health issue in terms of when we've done research, and it's going back across the world and 30 plus years, one of the most common issues that young people raise in terms of their priority importance in their healthcare and in research is confidentiality. The need to be able to talk about these things without their teacher finding out, or potentially one or the other of their parents finding out, until they can figure out what the health needs are and what to do. And so that confidentiality is critical for being able to ensure that young people are able to participate. It's also important as we think about community and that community respect and safety. Who counts as community? When we're talking about young people, thinking about that community does include families, it does include adults who work with young people, but it also includes young people. And when looking at the questions that we think we should be asking them and how we should be phrasing them, and what's important to them, we do need to think about who's in the room and how are we getting that information to be able to ask those questions? There has been a recent document that's come out about how to engage communities in order to ask about protected categories around discrimination, information about sexual orientation and gender identity and racialization and ethnic communities. And how do you ask those questions in ways that don't stigmatize or stereotype? And it's, for us, the experience has been that young people are at a different developmental stage and a different developmental place than adults. And the ways we ask the questions are often, they often need to be less nuanced and less sophisticated than adults in similar communities require. So when we do work with young people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or who are transgender and non-binary, the ways we frame what that means or how we define it or ask the question or the words we choose need to be calibrated for developmental stage. And oftentimes colleagues and adults will look at the go, oh, well, wait a minute, that's a little too simplistic, or that's not the right way to do it, without recognizing that, no, we've actually asked young people, and the development of those questions has involved a lot of consultation over a lot of years, and with an attention to their developmental capacity. But we also have that complexity, especially when you're dealing with large geographic boundaries, multiple countries and multiple languages at times. Where do you identify community, and who counts as community? If I am doing a study that includes 5 different countries, but I'm only engaging the understanding of gender and sexuality from the West Coast of Canada and what it's like here in Vancouver, and the understandings that we have among young people here and the words they choose and the ways they approach it, I'm not really engaging with the community if that community includes Spain or Ireland and young people who have very different perspectives in Hungary. And so part of that work of consultation and engagement and community does involve identifying the breadth of the community. I mentioned at the beginning that not everything needs to be a full-on community-based participatory research project, but that there are strategies, even with large-scale population-based surveys and other forms of data involvement. And this is why at Saewyc we do a lot of mixed methods research that includes things like a priori and post hoc engagement with young people to bring the data to them and ask them to put it in their context and what does it mean and how would we interpret it, as well as, so what would they recommend based on these findings? What can adults do? What can government do? What can they do to make a difference? And that work of engaging a broader community in the interpretation and the discussion helps ensure that even when we're doing large scale surveys with complex statistical analyses, it still remains embedded in community respect and the priorities of the young peoples whose lives are most affected, and for whom the questions are the importance of health equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that full discussion about focus on youth. So as promised, everyone, I'm going to give us an opportunity to take a stretch. I always start my lecture sessions with a little bit of yoga, and I'm not going to subject you to that, but I encourage you to stand up and take a stretch and a big breath, get that chi energy into you, or whatever you like to call it, and refresh those brain cells. So let's take 2 minutes for that. All right, everyone, I'll call you back to the session. Hope you feel loosened up and ready to take in the next two speakers, who I'm delighted to welcome to complete the session before we move into the plenary for some discussion. So our next speaker is Dr. Katrina Plamondon, and she is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Health and Social Development in the School of Nursing, UBC Okanagan. Dr. Plamondon is an Indigenous woman scholar of Cree and settler ancestry and a registered nurse. Her work as an equity scholar is grounded in critical anti-oppressive pedagogy and relational theory and practices. Her research focuses on critical questions about how to facilitate integration of equity-centered principles and practices across sectors and settings, equipping people to engage in practices, partnerships, policy, and society in ways that contribute to more equitable futures. She also plays a national leadership role in advancing health equity. So it's an honor to have you join us today, Katrina, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and, have I got it? Sharing the screen? Thank you. Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's really lovely to be with you today. I'm going to share with you, I think, a presentation that really will build on and extend what we've heard already today, and I hope gives you some good food for thought. But I'll start just with, whoops, oh, I skipped right to the end. Sorry about that. Oh my goodness. I pushed the wrong button and now just bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing, reset my slides, because otherwise I reveal everything and there's no mystery left. Okay, here we go. Present. Okay, try again. There, is it up again? Okay. All right, so I'm going to share with you a bit of a compilation and take a bird's eye view about research systems and research practices, and share with you what I hope will be some good insights and reflections from a number of different projects that I think are really relevant for learning about how research ethics can ask good questions about equity in the process and content of research. So I'll let everyone read that, just a few acknowledgements. And I'm going to start just by acknowledging that as I talk to you today, I think it's really important for all of us to be keeping in mind one of the first and most important equity questions we can ask is, who are we? Where do we come from, and why do we do this work? Because it helps us to understand who we are in the work and what motivates us, and how we understand ourselves in the work that we're doing and what we see about the work that we're doing. And so I think of myself as a bit of a spanner, because I occupy many different positions, like all of us do, but not always are they very visible. And as a nurse, I've worked in so many different parts of the system. So my spanning includes understanding what it's like to work in different parts of the system, from frontline care, even as I carried when I was early on in when I was doing my nursing degree, right through to working in critical care areas and public health and street outreach, to clinical areas and research administration kinds of areas and other leadership roles within health systems, and then also in academic areas and teaching. So I sort of span professionally. I have a spanning kind of lens because of my my mixed background, and yet my lens is really affected by both where I've spent a majority of my life, which is on the unceded and traditional territory of the Saewyc people, where I live very, very close to Okanagan Lake, was born by this lake and spent a lot of time by this lake. So I've been really grateful to be a guest in this area. And I also have ties to Treaty 4 area in what's now Saskatchewan, where my grandmother was born, on Fishing Lake First Nation. And so this is my attempt at learning Cree is slow, but Kapimotin Piatsik is a way of saying I walk gently, or may you walk gently. And so I'm going to invite you to think about walking gently through this content that I shared. And this is how I try to approach my work. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about equity practices and equity questions we can ask at a systems level. And here are just a few assumptions that I make in the work that I do, just to be really clear and upfront about where I'm coming from. And already a lot of this has been spoken to, so I'm not going to go in depth about definitions about health equity and health inequities, because I think my colleagues have already spoken so well to these. But one thing I would just add is that I think sometimes when we're talking about equity work or equity in general, we talk about it from a really, we can theorize it really well, and we can talk about the data really well, but sometimes we forget to talk about the experience of equity or inequity. And I think that, Jiva, to your point about racism as pathological, I think sometimes what we do is pay so much attention to what the numbers are telling us about burdens or vulnerabilities or marginalization, and we've sort of, sometimes we can lose the humanity of that. And so it's actually moments of interaction or ways that we ask questions that determine how equity or inequity is experienced. And so a lot of the questions I ask draw attention to the ways in which how we work in our day-to-day reinforce systems that make those inequities thrive or challenge those inequities. And I think an encouraging tone across the country right now in Canada is that there is an increasing emphasis and interest in equity, and some of it I find a bit rhetorical. There's a risk right now in the attention on equity, diversity, and inclusion policies as getting sort of one checkbox done and moving on. But I also think we have this beautiful window of opportunity where our national funding agency is highlighting just how important doing work that addresses and responds to equity is, as one of the single most important investments we can make in the overall well-being of everybody in Canada and really around the world. So paying attention to equity is being recognized as important for health research, not just in the content, but in the process of what we do. And I can't emphasize enough just how critical this is. This isn't a nice to do. It shouldn't be just a checkbox because we're invited to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, but because racism is so pathological that it is a life and death consideration in our country. And even if Canada and though Canadians and Canada tend to like to think about the fairness or the ease of access to healthcare services, actually it's not very universally accessible, and there's a lot that we can do to address what are long-standing issues, and we have a lot of room to go in these areas. The reason I think this is so important is because I think that one thing that I suppose surprises me most in the kind of work that I do is how often my colleagues, especially in nursing faculties where I spend a lot of time, although I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, but my fellow nurses are often still quite surprised to learn about the Truth and Reconciliation Report. They're still surprised to learn about the impacts of residential schools. Some are still surprised to learn about what Indian hospitals are. And I find it surprising that there's still a narrative of surprise, because this isn't new information. And it's not a surprise that intergenerational, institutional, and other kinds of trauma are determinants of health and access to healthcare. They're determinants of access to research, access to opportunity. They're determinants of many, many things. And if we don't pay attention to the way in which our work is situated in context and history, if we're not paying attention to the fact that how we think about the world, what we believe we understand about it, and the knowledges we're drawing upon, those actually shape what we believe is legitimate to do, then we've overlooked the choices that we are making about equity. And so a lot of what I'll share today are about invitations to think about the kinds of equity choices that exist within the domain of research ethics and research practice. And this is because research ecosystems are embedded in the same kinds of broader social systems and structures that are really defined by systems that uphold things that, although we don't like to say them, and sometimes it makes people quite uncomfortable to talk about them, but we have systems that are deeply colonial still, that uphold systems of white supremacy, that are designed to keep some voices loud and some voices quiet, that are designed to elevate and reproduce representation and voice in so many different ways that it is sometimes hard to see just how complex and embedded those systems are in shaping the different kinds of trajectories that people face in their lives, including the kinds of opportunities and experiences they might have with research. So the problem is that these systems are so vast and so surrounding in all aspects of our lives. We don't always see them. We see what we expect to see. And so sometimes the work that I do, especially with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Sana Sharam, we'll often use metaphors, and we'll use this one of fish and water. And so it goes like this: one fish comes up to another and the fish says, how's the water? And the other fish goes, what water? And it's really an invitation to think about these systems are so ubiquitous around us that we are not even conscious that we are swimming in water. We project our assumptions onto others, and we often interpret scenarios from our own lens and our own experiences. And so for those of us that are researchers or people who are in positions of providing some kind of oversight or review of the ethical considerations of research, if we're always interpreting what we're seeing from within the water and not necessarily recognizing the water, whether we know we're doing it or not, we can be really overlooking systems that are causing harm and not even knowing it. And I think we already heard some very powerful examples of how this can happen in very micro ways and in also very macro ways. I'm not going to spend too much time here, other than I just think if any researcher or anyone on a research ethics board or anyone involved in the health research ecosystem does not know just how far-reaching the impacts of these systems are on people's lives. We do have a reasonably okay report from the government of Canada about national inequalities. They use the word inequality rather than inequity, but they do take a look at impacts across many different aspects. And so it doesn't really matter what level of data, and whether we look at it in Canada or internationally, and whether we look at it in a municipal level by neighborhood, or if we make comparisons between countries, it does not matter what we look at. The differences between health and health outcomes and the kinds of life trajectories people lead are defined by stratifications by socioeconomic and geographic positionalities. So it does not matter where we're looking. These are very predictable differences in health outcomes, and therefore we cannot ignore just how impactful they are. We must know this, and we must be thinking about this, no matter whether we're thinking about research or talking about research that is extremely clinical or not. It always matters. And when we look at what researchers tend to do in our, so some of the work I've done is look internally at our research practices. So within global and public health, for example, a systematic review of publications that had some kind of intention of advancing equity action, and had some sort of focus on equity, so some sort of knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization focus, and a shared focus on health equity. What we found was that actually less than half of the articles in a sample size that was quite robust, over 330 articles, more than half of them talk about inequities without citing causes or referring to references or literature or evidence about those causes. So this is equivalent, I would equate this to talking about the COVID-19 pandemic without referring to a virus. It's that simple and that's obvious, but our practice is we have a very high tolerance for sort of what I would call a sort of intellectually lazy framing of health inequities. And even worse, and perhaps more concerning, is that research designs rarely do anything to intervene on those causes. So we have a lot of public research dollars going into research about health inequities in some way without citing causes, without using evidence about causes, and without doing anything about causes. And so these are questions that go beyond the integrity of a study design in terms of its methodological integrity, and go towards issues of questions of equity in what questions are we asking, how are we asking it, how are we framing what the problem is, and how are we structuring a response that actually includes, to Elizabeth's point, the people who it affects. So if we extend some of these questions to thinking about what do our research ethics documents and guidance, what do they offer us as we navigate thinking about questions of ethics? So one of the pieces of work I did, it's been a little bit of time, so there may be some changes that I haven't accounted for because this is a few years old now, but one of the pieces of work I've done is looking at TCPS2 for its responsiveness to research that deals with equity, and to see if there are any gaps or places where it provides some guidance or provides less guidance that might be helpful. And so in looking at what TCPS2 and its core principles do for us in thinking about issues of equity, there are some persistent challenges and concerns. And some of them I think have come out in the earlier presentations already. Some of the concerns have to do with an emphasis on procedural and contract kinds of languages that really set a tone for risk aversion and about avoiding harm that might come back to the institution or back to the Research Ethics Board in a way that sometimes can distract from other issues of equity. There is a tendency, with the exception of Chapter 9, there's a tendency for an assumption about research ethics being relevant mostly for individuals. And when we talk about community, it's sometimes quite vague. And I think the most important thing is that these principles, like other ethical principles or other statements that are idealistic and aspirational, like even some of our human rights declarations, even there is a literature and a solid critique about principles like these being generated from systems that are imbued with coloniality, that are known to be patriarchal, paternalistic, gendered, white, and Eurocentric. And so there are some problematic assumptions that are embedded within that and are part of not seeing the water. So here are some of them. And there might be others, but among the ones that I think are most important for us to think about in this context are how TCPS2 does or does not pay attention to challenging researchers to address issues of power, especially those that have to do with legacies of colonial or neo-colonial relationships. So I think TCPS, or the Chapter 9, does do this to a certain degree, but it doesn't necessarily weave it throughout the entire process as fulsomely as it could. And some of that manifests in some of these other concerns. So I think, for example, the emphasis on participants sometimes can overlook the issues of power and legacies of coloniality with partners who aren't necessarily research participants who are contributing to generating data, but who are partners on a team. And there are issues of ethics and reciprocity and power that play into to who is included and who has voice and leadership and say in shaping the direction of research. And I think this is particularly salient as we have and more emphasis on patient-engaged or patient-oriented research. And in some of the research I've done about what people who navigate many social exclusions want from research ethics and from research systems generally, they echo this concern about the emphasis on participants doesn't necessarily draw attention to research ethics questions about their role as partners or advisors on a research team. Another challenge is often a sort of an underlying assumption that the question of fairness and equity rests mostly on access to participation as the most important equitable question, rather than also asking questions about whether this question responds to or risks perpetuating inequities. And if we haven't asked the question about whether research risks perpetuating inequities, if we haven't invited reflection about that from the research team, then we risk contributing to perpetuating those inequities. Another concern that comes up both from this analysis and from other research is about mechanisms of accountabilities. And sometimes this has to do with a tone of presumption about the kind of relationship that exists between researcher and research, and between researcher and research participants, and a sort of tendency to privilege the dominant kinds of research that is carried out in the health research ecosystem, which tends to be biomedical, individualistic, and extractive. And there are some questions about those kinds of relationships that we could do better. The process of research ethics review and going through and using TCPS2 also relies on and extends a lot of trust in researchers about accurate and insightful self-assessment. And it doesn't actually invite or require the same degree of peer review as is invited in other aspects of the research process. And so we've heard from research participants that what this leaves them with is very few places to go if they have questions about equity and integrity in the research process, especially if they are not a participant themselves. It also relies on researchers' focus and attention in their own critical reflection. So if they don't believe something is worthy of attention, they're not likely to put attention on that. And if we are all like fish swimming in the water, there are some inherent problems with this. In addition to a lot of the issues of consent that have already been discussed today, I think that there is a risk in emphasizing a much more contractual instead of a relational kind of ongoing consent, where the research at the consent form becomes a sort of we've covered that, it's done and it's gone, rather than something that is understood by all people involved in the research as a relational commitment to upholding the ethical and equitable integrity of that work. And another point I would just about consent is that I think sometimes and this is back to what Carolyn was discussing earlier, consenting to what? Sometimes consent is often very clearly about participation, but I think there's a presumption that people understand how the research process goes past gathering data. And the analysis and interpretation process is not always something that people are included in a relational way and consenting to. And so if we always assume that people universally understand how the research process works, we've sort of assumed that we have these highly skilled specialists as researchers who are doing a lot of work with the data analysis. And if interpretation is left to the researcher as the instrument of interpretation and analysis, there is a risk of voice being lost. And so I think there are things that we can do to include people beyond their consent to sharing their stories or contributing data, but to think about ways to include their consent and participation in making sense of what the findings of research are, or what the implications ought to be, or the so what piece of research. And I think another piece that has stood out a lot for me in the research I've been involved in more recently about people's desires for what would contribute to a more inclusive experience have to do with using inclusion criteria to support who participates from a sort of methodological integrity question, and not necessarily extending it to thinking about equity and how we justify who is being afforded representation in that study. And so we can think more creatively about representation and voice in sampling strategies, no matter what kind of research we're doing. And we can also extend our thoughts about inclusion to go beyond just what perspectives or positionalities are included, to be thoughtful to the kinds of conditions that need to be set in order for research to be genuinely inclusive. And I think this comes back to things like questions about compensation of people's time, and what is considered coercive, or what standard is extended for people to offer their time at compensation levels that are far below even minimum wage standards, for example. So I think we need to start shifting our mental model of what is a reasonable compensation for people's participation, or what do people need to be offered in order to be meaningfully included? Do they need access to childcare? Do they need access to transportation? Do they need access to some kind of translation? And how are we thinking about equity in terms of what those needs might be? So not everybody will need the same kinds of supports to participate, and it is okay and important to extend a responsive set of supports rather than assuming that equal compensation or equal supports is going to mean equitable inclusion, because they're not the same things. So some of the questions that we can ask and use are to extend equity questions about the team, about voice and representation, about the content and focus of research, but also especially about the methodology and processes being used, because even the most bench science kinds of research can ask good equity questions. I think that we should be practicing humility, reflexivity, and solidarity, no matter where we are positioned. We need to build capacity to see that water and navigate it. We need to be willing to apply a critical lens and invite our peers and colleagues to talk about their equity action plans and what they're doing. We need to identify and challenge norms or structures that might inadvertently perpetuate inequities, and create spaces to talk about this, because we're not going to get it all right. It's relatively new that there is this much public dialogue about issues of equity, or any interest in talking about what the water is or how systems of oppression are working. And we're going to make mistakes. And if we don't create a system or a place where we're very safe and free to talk about the mistakes that we're making and learn from them, we are likely to just get caught up in feeling very scared to ask the wrong questions, or to be judged for being in some way to be judged for not having the right kinds of virtues, and that will not help us to move forward in having greater capacity to navigate these systems. I'm not sure how much time I am. I'm going to just breeze through a few other tools that I think are really helpful tools to help support those kinds of critically reflective questions. So one of the projects I've been involved in is the elaboration of these 6 equity-centered principles that were designed for use in global health research, but we are using them in many different settings, including examining nursing curricula for equity considerations and anti-racism transformations in our curriculum and course syllabi, and creation of equity responsive teaching environments and learning environments. We're also using them with municipalities who are thinking about integrating equity considerations in their work, and with health system settings. So even though these were generated from the context of use in global health, I think they resonate broadly and are useful, and they're available open access online, and there's many resources to support them. But they are designed to offer a set of questions that anybody can ask about any kind of work, so that we are paying attention to issues of equity. Another set of tools that we are introducing, I'm working with folks in interior health to integrate equity considerations and invitations to researchers to talk about their equity plans in their submissions for operational approval. So if there's a team who wants to work with interior health and wants to do research that involves interior health resources, time, people, or spaces, they're going to have to start talking about what equity considerations they are taking in the work that they're proposing. And so we have designed a policy intervention and a suite of resources to support that work. I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but generally, I'm just going to say that what the policy does is invite people to be critically reflective and make an open declaration about the kinds of considerations they're making. We've modeled it after the way that CHR invites consideration of sex and gender-based or sex and gender considerations in research. And so it mirrors something that researchers are familiar with, and just gives them an open text box to state what are their considerations. This isn't like an authoritative policy that says yes or no, or will be used to decline research. It's very invitational. And so if a researcher has said no, what they will get back is an invitation to rethink that answer. And if they say no a second time, then they'll get an invitation back with some resources to support how they might think about it a little bit more. So they won't be denied operational approval, but they will be invited to think very clearly about it. And some of the research or the resources we have are a guide for how to do it that has a curated list of examples of how we can integrate equity considerations across a broad spectrum of types of research and in all aspects of research. So whether or not the focus of the research problem or question is on equity, we can ask equity questions in research process. There's a little video that goes with it, and so we have additional resources to support it. So those are just a few examples of how we can think about equity in our work and what equity questions, why equity questions are ethical questions. And I would just close by saying that no matter where we are or where we're working, all of us have a sphere of influence of some kind. And research ethics boards certainly have a sphere of influence. And I would encourage anyone who's sitting on a research ethics board, or anyone who's playing a role in peer review, or who has a leadership role within an academic setting, or in an organizational setting that is working with partners who are engaged in research, to have good questions built into every single one of your meeting agendas to say, what are we doing to talk about equity today? Have we thought about equity in this work today? What do we need to come back to? How are we adopting a practice today about asking good equity questions? Because anytime we embrace an equity lens, we can do more to identify the choices that we have. And even if it's very small, we can have a big impact. So I think, close it with that. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That was wonderful. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to keep moving on, and again, just ask you all to start getting ready for the plenary and to start thinking about those perhaps cross-cutting questions, but please also questions directly to any of the presenters. So now moving on to Dr. Lachowsky, who is an associate professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria. Dr. Lachowsky serves as a research director for the Community-Based Research Center, which is a non-profit organization that promotes the health of people of diverse sexualities and genders through research and intervention development. He champions interdisciplinary community-based population health research with 2 SLGBTQIA+ people using a social justice framework in order to achieve health equity. Delightful to have you take the floor, Nathan.
Thanks, Malcolm, and thanks, everyone. I just have to acknowledge all of the amazing nursing leadership that we have just witnessed over the last few speakers. I'm always a fan of getting to work with my nursing colleagues, and just grateful for all of the words that have been shared before my comments. As Malcolm said, my name is Nathan Lachowsky. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm calling in today from Lekwungen territories, same territories as Chifa, on the southern part of Vancouver Island. And I think in terms of just connecting the land acknowledgement in particular to some of the things that I've been witnessing, I guess, in the research environment of late, I was recently on some CIHR review panels, and CIHR has added 2 questions to the standard ResearchNet forms. One about, does this research involve Indigenous people? And then a second that says, does your work adhere to TCPS2 Chapter 9? And without disclosing too much confidential details, I would say the majority of applications said no to adhering to TCPS2 Chapter 9. And so my question to CIHR was, how is that okay? And clearly we need to raise this as an ethical flag. So I'm hoping that as applications come to the REBs across the country, that those ethics issues are raised, because it is not optional. And I think it's now being passed down to the REB boards to be able to manage due to engagement with and adherence to this particular chapter. So, so that's kind of one thing that has been a little bit shocking to me. And those, I think there's kind of this era that we're living in right now, where if it's not capital I Indigenous health research, that somehow these things don't apply. And even for studies, particularly as an epidemiologist who does a lot of quantitative work, who are purporting to do population representative work, that includes Indigenous people because they're a part of our communities and they're a part of who we study. And so, Jordan, I think this aspect of how we divide up people and where we draw lines, Jordan, is a result of colonization and a good example of how it continues to go onwards. And I think also about some of the challenges in terms of how those policies can also create disincentives for people to try to engage with, learn, and do better work, ethical work with Indigenous communities. And so I think this aspect of really thinking about how are we supporting our researchers so that their answer to all of this kind of new questioning isn't, well, I'm just not going to include Indigenous people in my study because that's the most ethical thing to do. And I think this aspect of all of these things that we're talking about, to me, really evoke the need for us to focus on capacity building, not just for REB members, but also for our researcher communities. And I know my previous colleagues have spoken to this as well. So Malcolm talked a little bit about some of the affiliations that I have and some of the work we do. To me, I think some of the things that are really relevant for the conversation today, like my colleagues, I work with many different formal nonprofit organizations. I work with different kinds of government agencies and groups, but I also work with independent or individual community researchers, sometimes referred to as patient partners. And I think there's some interesting tensions or questions that'll come up in terms of when we think about people who have a certain lived experience and organizations that have a particular kind of existence, and how organizations and how people are seen as representing or representative of broader communities of research partners. And in terms of our work, I do lots of work related to HIV and sexually transmitted infections and other public health notifiable infections, although those do vary across jurisdictions. We work with new health technologies, some of which are approved by Health Canada, others of which are kind of in developmental stages. And that introduces questions of kind of ethics in terms of their implications for screening versus diagnosis. Work on issues of substance use and illicit substance use, on sexual behavior and illicit sexual behaviors. And also during some of the theoretical models or frameworks we use are about life course experiences and about syndemics or co-occurring during epidemics or inequities that are within a particular population. And that really makes us think about adverse childhood events. And so that also then kind of evokes duty to report pieces as well. So that's just a little bit of situating some of the work that I've been in. I've just got a few points that I want to, I guess, add to the conversation, and I'm really looking forward to the open chat with folks. So there is this really interesting bend in the REB process from my point of view around scientific peer review and whether this work has been scientifically peer reviewed. There's very little commensurate balance to thinking about community review or community peer review, particularly when we think about some of the populations and work that we've been thinking about. I was part of an organization called the HIV Clinical Trials Network during my postdoc, who did both a scientific and a peer review. These were projects that were specifically focused around HIV. And for a project to move forward in a funding competition for them, they needed to pass both of those, and they were segregated processes. And we can talk a little bit about how ideal that is or isn't. And I know there's community representation on REBs. But in general, to be able to have a scientific peer review say, yeah, the study looks great, and it ticks all the boxes we want, and to have a community of folks represented from people living with HIV say, no, this study can't go forward as is, it's not addressing many of the things that my colleagues have raised, and that it doesn't matter that it scores 4.9 out of 5 on the scientific review scale. And so I think there's some interesting models for us to think about and to look at in terms of how we might advance some of this. And then a few other pieces that I kind of think about in terms of some of the scientific review versus community review piece are this aspect of validated scales. This comes up a lot in psychometrics and during collaborations with many of my psychologist friends and colleagues. And sometimes those validated scales are incredibly harmful for someone in the community to witness, to experience, and to process through. And so who are they validated for and by? And what does it mean when we expose people to a particular language that is trying to measure perhaps a negative reality? And how are we balancing the kind of this aspect of scientific validity versus, again, kind of community-oriented language and responses to the fact that some scales assume gender binaries, some scales assume heterosexuality, some scales assume whiteness, socioeconomic privilege, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that is often a very granular aspect of work that I think REBs, in my experience, haven't always engaged in, but I do think it's something to kind of think a little bit about as it is a part of what we put into our protocols. And also just, and related to that, just a shout out to a colleague, Bill Fisher at Western University, who did some work on how questions were placed together in a blood donor screening questionnaire, and found that where questions land and what order they are experienced by a participant shapes implicit bias. And that's a really simple piece, but again, something that, again, I think, for us to think about in terms of like, what is the impact of our research on people, and what might be some unintended consequences of scientifically rigorous or valid research. I think the other piece around community peer review is that I really worry sometimes about the extra burden that we then place and expect on community to participate in our processes as institutions. And when we ask for things like formal letters of support that are signed, when we have all this additional administrative work that is not compensated by our institutions, not necessarily compensated in a research project inherently, I think that can really pose some challenges. And also, whose lived experiences needs to be performed. And how do we kind of expect or require outness in relation to a variety of things, not just sexual orientation or gender, I think are really important pieces for us to hold as we think about how to support a rigorous community peer review process as well. So some of the things that I would prompt folks at REBs and OREs to reflect on is, what do you know about the community involved in the study? This, I think, gets to some of the reflexive pieces that Katrina was just talking about. I would ask you to think about, where did you learn about those things? Are the assumptions that you have valid? Are they fair? Are they based on particular laws or regulations? If you think some things are illegal or some things are allowed or not allowed. And if so, I think one of these things around relationality is the reviews are blind to us as researchers. We don't know who is doing the review. And oftentimes the feedback we get is very stripped away of anything that could be identifying with who that person is, which unfortunately makes it harder for us to be able to think about how best to respond sometimes. And so I think where there can be context and situation and positionality shared in feedback, I think that actually could be quite helpful for us in terms of really having a good, rigorous, ethical conversation about particular feedback an REB might have on a protocol. And that I would generally say it's better to ask questions than it is to make statements. We have a few examples of this in our work where people have said things back to us in an REB review and we're like, actually, that's wrong. And now we're in this awkward position of needing to share with people additional information to basically counter that. And it's just the fact that there's often a lot more complexity and nuance to all of the work that we do. And as academics, we embrace that complexity and nuance. And it's hard and I think unfair for us to expect an REB member to know that in every single context of every protocol they're reviewing. But nonetheless, I think framing things as questions over statements can help quite a bit. Just a little bit to pick up on some of the things that Elizabeth shared as well, in terms of like, what do we know and think about certain communities and groups? There was some really great empirical work that was done by a group in the US, Brian Masansky, Mecca Paganel, and others, looking at sexual and gender minority youth who were aged 14 to 17, and comparing different research practices or protocols or activities in relation to routine healthcare practices as well as everyday life practices. And what they found is, amongst these minority youth, that filling out a survey that asked about sexual orientation or gender identity was more comfortable to a youth than having their vision checked at their doctor's office, or being asked questions about their future career and job interests. So I just really want to like think about that and like sit for a second on the sense that, like, as a queer youth, do you know what I mean? I would rather be asked about my sexual orientation and gender than I would be about what I'm doing with my career and my job and my work. And I don't think often that we're thinking about that differently, or that we're evoking this thing when we think about how we kind of are protecting youth. Further, the youth said they'd rather get an oral swab, and that's actually just as comfortable as posting a picture on social media to them. Again, taking these really different activities and lining them up against each other. And all of that I've talked about so far was much more comfortable than having to ask their parents to participate in a research study. And I think that really speaks to what Elizabeth was talking about. So if you need empirical evidence about these things, this study was designed for this particular reason. It is really focused on sexual and gender minority youth, but I'll just pop a link into one particular paper from the study and the team that's there. And I would, again, behoove REBs and OREs to ask these questions, because there is increasing evidence, which is unfortunate that we have to produce in a particular way to respond to these things, but nonetheless are there. And those are some of the great things that we get to do as researchers. And then I would say, and I think this also, Katrina really, I think, raised this nicely, what does the researcher and the research team that's in front of you know about the community they're working with? What is their relationship to the people and the organizations and the issues that they're studying? And we have this part of the REB where we talk about our expertise. And I feel like very rarely do I ever get feedback about that. I think we often focus on the protocolized aspects of things, but very little in terms of actually us situating ourselves as a research team and perhaps being asked some more questions about, do you have connections to this part of the community? What is your experience working with this, et cetera? And I think that's really a space where I think then it allows some additional trust or some confidence on the REB side to think about, okay, we might be able to maybe have some more faith in this research team because they've been working with this organization for 30 years, with this community for 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would really encourage REBs to think about encouraging a more fulsome and rounded conversation of that. Again, keeping in mind some of these aspects of like disclosure expectation, et cetera. And then the other thing I think is there an explicit articulation of research values or principles? I think this is something that, do you know what I mean? Sometimes the nitty gritty of every single situation can't be articulated well in an REB protocol. It doesn't make sense. But I think if we go back to a principled piece of how is this team operating? How are they functioning? Do you know what I mean? How does that jive in terms of the concerns an REB might raise? And then lastly, I think all of this kind of, my last point here is just about the jurisdiction of REB, particularly for community-based research projects. And so I think there is a really messiness in our system right now about the fact that most REBs that we're engaging with are at our post-secondary education institutions, but we're often working with community agencies that don't have REBs, that haven't inherently necessarily gotten all of the infrastructure in place to do that. And so oftentimes the work with these organizations, the benefit that we provide as a university to society is access to be able to navigate this complex bureaucratic policy environment that is required. And to be honest, just following all those things doesn't mean that practice is inherently more ethical than someone who is not ticking all of those boxes. It is just the way that we are trying to facilitate that. And so I do really think that we need to think through, like, how do we respect community autonomy and leadership and research? What do we offer from our resource-rich institutions to community-based organizations, partnerships, et cetera, in terms of supporting, to many of the comments before, a more equitable and just society? And I think of this in like a really detailed sense of is asking for a logo of an institution to be added to a consent form ethical? How does that, from the REB's point of view, reflect the relationship that some communities might have with a particular institution or a particular system? And how does that fit into ethics as a piece? And I think one of the challenges, again, is that we get these kinds of requests as researchers at times with no context and no kind of positioning of why that might be more ethical or not. And oftentimes, you know what I mean, it's simpler without any of that context and conversation and relationship to simply abide by the requests of the REB to do so. But I do think that that really begs this question of, I mean, how do we advance our expectations or our standards in context specific ways, as opposed to just saying universally, this is what we expect to see. And I think the broader kind of question here is, how do we support the community to have a sense of safety, not just a sense of safety, but a reality of safety in the research, and to be respected through their experience of the research process. So those are really my key points that I wanted to add. And yeah, looking forward to a robust conversation over the next half hour.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks everyone. So we have 26 minutes left for discussion, and we've heard some wonderful inputs from our speakers. Caroline focused a little bit on the family voice in research ethics boards, and looked at the problems around multiple consent requests, and raised questions around REB assessments being stressful for community participants, and also questioned issues around what is meaningful compensation. Zifa, for example, was looking really at the question of what is in a consent and what is not in a consent, with an example about metal hypersensitivity, and put a lot of emphasis on the issues around trust and beliefs in the reliability, truthability, or strength of language and sensitive and method sensitive questions. Elizabeth also spoke to that and raised a number of issues, putting a lot of focus on what I was hearing to be participatory methodologies, stressing nothing about us without us, asking questions about who is and who is not in the room, and called on us to understand emerging capacity of participants to understand risks and to participate. Katrina put her focus of her presentation on how to ask about equity and emphasized that equity is an experience. She reminded us that all of our work is situated in history, and it shapes what we think is legitimate to do. She provided some really nice challenges to TCPS2, and Nathan referred to that later. And I think we're quickly seeing that this is being regarded as a minimum requirement. And also provided a number of useful ideas about what researchers and REBs should be doing, as well as some principles and tools for equity considerations. And then Nathan ended off talking about his experience of the extent to which TCPS2 is not adhered to, despite all its challenges. He talked about what do REBs know about communities in the study that they are assessing. And he gave an example about sexual preferences as a question sitting in an REB and often considered to be a very invasive and intrusive question, where it is in particular communities perceived not to be the case. He called on a better understanding about the relationship between researchers and communities, and put emphasis on how we respect community autonomy. So that's just a few things that I noted down just to get those juices going. There is one question that I'd like to deal with in the box, in the chat box, before we open up for any cross-cutting questions. And this is really directed to you, Elizabeth. I think it was provided during your input. And the statement, the gamble between paternalistic and trusting in youth resilience is a tough line to draw. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure what's meant about trusting in youth resilience. I think I would rather trust in youth capacity and actually assess that capacity to understand the risks and the benefits of research. Oftentimes, and I really do appreciate Nate providing Brian Mustansky and his colleagues' great paper. There are similar ones that actually talk about and engage with youth in understanding research. Much of the research that we do, and I think it's important to remember, a lot of that research is not like randomized clinical trials of surgical procedures. It isn't the kind of work that Zifa's talking about in terms of actually putting potentially toxic metals into people's bodies with long-term health effects. A lot of the research is actually drawing on people's perspectives and lived experience and stories and lives and understanding how they navigate the world around them. And so from a sense of overall risk, from a sense of the potential harms of engaging with young people, it generally does fall under that, yep, I'd rather talk about this with people than talk about my eyes, or answer those particular questions. But I also think that there's harm in not asking, and I think that's an important consideration, is when we think that we're being protective and we've removed the opportunity for young people, especially. I'm not talking about children under the age of like 10 or 11 or 12, but adolescents especially, they navigate a pretty sophisticated and challenging world on a day-to-day basis. And they make a lot of decisions about their health and their life and their behaviors, many of which actually have like long-term life-changing impacts, the way all of us do, and some of which they have no choice about because, you know, the world around us has inherent risk that we can't necessarily avoid. But to foreclose the possibility that they would have an opportunity to actually think about whether they want to participate and weigh those risks and then decide to or not to is an important loss if we've created barriers for young people to participate because they won't if it requires making them less safe by engaging someone else in their life or knowledge about them in ways that might not continue to protect them. Then we've lost some key information and they've lost an opportunity to actually have an impact on changing their healthcare, on changing their school environment and context, or on having an impact on the world around them. So yes, we do need to ensure, especially with marginalized groups who already face a loss of power and a lot of negative attitudes and experiences to, you know, in the wider society. We don't want to increase harm to them, but we also don't want to shut them out of the opportunity to actually have a meaningful voice in the decisions about their lives.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. So I'm going to throw out a question here, and I'm going to do a quick round with all of you. I think I've been hearing from the inputs given that REBs should be challenged to appreciate that they don't have the deep relationships and sometimes the sustained and enduring relationships that researchers have with communities. So that leaves REBs in a particular sort of difficult position. Do they just say, well, we trust you. You've obviously got a very good relationship with your community. And there must be some reason about why you asked your questions in this way. So we'll just let you go ahead. Or sort of on the other extreme, becoming kind of splitting the hairs and writing long responses and demanding changes. I know that my experience of sitting on an REB as a medical expert in the SFU REB is I often feel, oh goodness, if only the researchers were here and we could have a bit of a dialogue about this and actually appreciate many things, including the relationships that these researchers have with their participants. So let's start with you, Katrina. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, as a researcher who does mostly dialogue-based research, I think this is a lovely idea. I'm fully noting my bias. But one of the things that I wrote down as I was listening and that I think is relevant here is that there's like a lot of time rushing pressure that I think gets in our way in so many aspects of doing research generally. And I think that there are two things that particularly get in the way, both from the research ethics review side and the researcher side. So researchers, sometimes I hear some of my colleagues complaining about, oh, I got to go through this and that, and I got to fill out this form. Like there's a little bit of a perceived burden for long paperwork and jumping through hoops that don't seem like they're serving the bigger picture of what they need. Not that people don't want to do things ethically, it's just that sometimes there's a feeling of a mismatch between what we have to do on one side to satisfy one set of demands that don't necessarily honor what we believe to be ethical and integral ways of engaging in research. And on the other hand, the research ethics reviewers, they don't always have all of the nuance or all of the detail, because sometimes it's hard to capture all of that integrity and relational ethic and complexity in the boxes that are available. And so neither party is really getting to tell the story or ask the questions that they need. And I think that if we could shift away from a perception of needing to rush so much, and if we could find ways to create a little bit of space to talk through these things, I think it would serve everyone in a very good way. Because you know, some people can say things that sound really good on paper, but don't actually translate to really good relationships with community anyways. So we can write about stuff that's actually sounds good, but isn't good. And you're not going to know that from an ethics review set of boxes either. So if you could have a conversation, I think you could understand and ask questions of each other and arrive at a much more sincere and equity responsive approach to that bigger picture desire that all of us share about an ethical, like a thread of ethics that continues beyond just filling out a form. So yeah, I think it's a very good idea.
Zifa, over to you. What are your thoughts about how research ethics boards and researchers can get better understanding about how to achieve community respect and safety?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. In terms of having the researchers be present at some of these review meetings, I think that's a great idea. Back in the days when I was doing my master's project, we had an IRB in the States assignment where we had to go shadow what they do. And that was something that was fundamental in that particular setting, where they actually invited the researchers into the meetings to address some of the questions that that the team or the board had. And then the researcher was excused, and then they had the deliberation and decided what they were going to do. So I think that's a great idea. I also think that, you know, I want to trust, and I believe that the ethics boards are doing the best that they can. But I think that the way in which we're doing it does not always address issues of trust or distrust or harms that are happening or have happened, right? It's all about protecting the future harms, right? Like, you know, can we sign this consent so that tomorrow after the study is done, nothing bad comes to us, where in the real time, there are harms that are happening or have happened, but our research processes has not allowed us to address those in real time. So I give the example of, you know, at least including that information in the consent so that, you know, from this point onwards, that trust is being, we're working on rebuilding that trust. And trust doesn't really appear as a bioethics principle, but is obviously fundamental to everything that we do. And I think one of the questions we need to keep asking, regardless of who you're working with, is how am I engendering this community trust, and in what ways can I enhance that trust? And sometimes the ethics don't have the answer. They don't necessarily have the answer. So only engaging with either the community, engaging with the researcher, even we're talking about having participatory research, patient-oriented. How about having somebody on the ethics that actually have lived and worked that life to be able to chime in terms of the conversations that are happening? So that's just some of my thoughts.
Right, so I'm going to come to you, Caroline, to continue this conversation. And just to note that in throwing out this question, perhaps a bit provocatively, I must honor and take note of the tremendous work that OREs do before applications are brought forward to the REBs. You know, at our REB meetings, we presented with the statistics of the month or since the last meeting that the ORE's undertaken. They are working like crazy with tremendous engagement with researchers, processing those applications before they come to the board. So, and notwithstanding all of that, over to you, Caroline, to talk about how we can try and find a deeper consensus between the researcher and the REB about community respect and safety.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting point in just kind of raising, Malcolm, the fact that the number of applications that any REB will receive is increasing exponentially, I'm sure. the amount of time that they're given and the resources and the level of education and support that they get is also something that needs to be recognised. You're asking a group of people to be able to review a wide scope of studies with very nuanced pieces in them specifically in a very quick time turnaround. So actually, I was having a few sidebar conversations with some people I know in the audience throughout the studies, asking them questions in relation to the conversations. And one of them was, you know, it's about the REB processes. We're thinking about it as a beginning step here, but also that accountability part as you go back depends on how set you are, whether you're 3, 6, 9, or 12 months for review. But actually the inclusion of your REB once your study's going, if I think about, you know, metals in my body, then I think actually what happens is the fact that where is the REB's responsibility in that? So actually, are we disproportionately trying to select some of this bias and some of this burden to different places? Whose is it really? And also, you know, let's be honest here, I'll be completely frank, is no research is safe. It's a level of safety. And we have to determine whether it's safe. Not a single research study is ever safe. It isn't. Not whether it be emotionally or whether it be physically. There is some inherent risk in everything that we do. It's just about trying to determine the risk. So I think from my experience too is, you know, you raise a good point. I came from a place where actually you did go and speak to the REB board. That was part of the pre-requirement. So going to the REB board with actually a patient partner, you know, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, to be able to give that presentation was really great, because then the knowledge holder is also somebody different. So it was a great way to do it. But we can't ask the burden on the REB without the investment in the REB and the processes around it. Otherwise, we've just, you know, we've given them too much work to do in a short space of time. And it really is then becomes that balance. And I have to confess, in preparing for this panel, I went to look at the literature to see about, you know, what have we done to understand the meaning of being in a research board? What's it like? You know, have we got, you know, hidden emotional burden of being exposed to some of the things that you then take away? It's really interesting. I didn't find a great deal of information. And I was really surprised about the fact that we have this big system and such little knowledge about it. So if anybody has found anything, please do send it in my direction, because I really struggle to find decent things to read. So yeah, so I think we've just got to be mindful about those pieces and what those burdens will mean if we're asking people to change their structure and process, recognizing that everything we do is risky. So I'm not sure whether I helped them, Malcolm, in any way at all.
No, good. Thank you. Thank you. Elizabeth, what about you? I mean, you spoke about, you know, can the REB understand the emerging capacity of participants to understand risks and participate? How do we achieve that?
Yeah, I also would like to speak in favor of that potential to have dialogue, or to, at least in some cases, if not, you know, every study, invite the researchers to have the conversation rather than having a dialogue of boxes and electronic communications. But at the same time, I also recognize that the volume of work at large institutions like UBC, where we have multiple REBs and a variety of things going on, becomes really prohibitive in terms of just the burden of trying to even organize those kinds of meetings. That said, I've had the opportunity a number of times to be tapped by an REB where they basically have said, you know what, we've seen a number of your ethics applications and the work that you do and who you're doing it with, and we would like you to come and talk about this because we feel like it would be really helpful to have some further knowledge and some detailed examples, because we're really impressed with whatever it is your group is doing. And it occurs to me that that may actually create an opportunity for, in part, just like what we're doing here today, but sometimes more specifically as REBs are recognizing some areas of their knowledge that would benefit from some additional insights or experience and examples from researchers who are doing the work as well, that dialogue may actually provide some really useful information. I am mindful that the regularly rotating members of the REB means that as a researcher who's been engaged with UBC's ethics for almost 18 years now, and a lot of research ethics applications over the years, that every time we submit one, even if it is identical to 6 other ones we've done in the past 10 years, there's always a bit of a random element of this time around, someone's actually saying, no, wait a minute, what about that? Or they want something more, or they want something different, because there are different people at the table, and the level of experience and the knowledge. And somebody on the board now has a teenager, and they're like suddenly applying this to their particular teen, even though their teen might not be like the teens that we're working with. But that sort of ongoing community of knowledge within an REB does shift and change. And that provides both opportunities and challenges for researchers. So I would suggest that you do have the opportunity to also connect with and reach out outside of a specific research application to some of the researchers who have grappled with some of the really thorny ethical challenges in their particular types of research, to get their perspective of how they're thinking it through and what their experiences have been, or what knowledge they have from the community of researchers, like the paper that Brian Mustanski's team put together, or the other work that's happened that provides some really good evidence base to help ethics boards sort through when they're not experts on all of these things, or they're not embedded in the communities themselves, but where they do have an obligation or a responsibility to not just say, well, we're just going to take everybody's word for it, or gee, it sounds good, but not actually give some critical thought to the ethics and implications. So I think that sometimes that's another possibility, if in the absence of being able to actually invite every researcher and their entire team to come answer the questions about a particular project.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And that reminds me, I'm honored to be really be part of such a rich experience, dialogue experience that's happening at SFU right now, looking at ethical foundations of research with a focus on Indigenous health research work. And we've now had 4 dialogues of about 3 or 4 hours each. I think it's 4 or 5. And those have been incredibly rich, with a few REB and ORE members that have attended. But even those dialogues pose problems because not everybody was there. And so now when we return to our next ethics board meeting, half of us are going to have had those conversations and half not. Nathan, over to you. We've got 2 minutes left.
I'm a fast talker. I think just to name, we all work in the same system, do you know what I mean? And we all have shared frustrations. And I think there is often this aspect of people feeling pitted against each other. But I do really feel like our ethics folks, at least in my experience working with the folks in the UVic office, has been a great experience in terms of feeling like we're on the same track, trying to go in the same direction of enabling good ethical research. So just a shout out to everyone who works very hard in this field. We're naturally critical as scholars, and so I think sometimes it comes across as critiques of people or practice, but this is really about the system that we're operating within. I do really think my response to this is like, are we asking non-community-based research any of these similar questions and expectations, or do we have a different set of expectations for these particular kinds of projects? That's one thing. I think the other is that if REBs really rethink what is high risk and what is vulnerable, or who is vulnerable, that would really change the burden of review, which would streamline a lot of things. And I think there is sometimes some really deep-seated assumptions about who is vulnerable and what kinds of questions or research practice are higher risk. And so I think that's one thing that also balances that. I think we really need to encourage our researchers to talk about the benefits. We've been told we can't say in some of our things that we're going to change policy, even though we have history of policy change from our research program. And so I think sometimes like there is this hesitation to be too forward about what the potential benefits of something are. But a few simple qualifiers can really help emphasize what are the potential benefits of work, which is what we're trying to balance in our ethical reviews. And then I do really think, as I said before, we need to use that expertise experience section of the REB of who the team is more, and could really prompt researchers to talk about their use of CABs, of patient advisors, et cetera, et cetera. And that again can help the REB have more of that information and trust. And that fundamentally, I don't think that like this idea of moving to in-person meetings is sustainable in our current model. I think it's really a nice idea, but I do think what we should think about are those things that we can do outside of the day-to-day research ethics piece to build capacity and relationships and that sharing that in a much more sustainable way, because even in our case, I think like our REB doesn't meet about every protocol. So it would be a special thing and it would make things even longer and slower. So I think that we have to think outside of our typical day-to-day to address some of these things.
Thank you, Nathan. So that brings us to the end of the session. And Isabel, sorry not being able to come to you, but I think your comment on the chat box supports this dialogue theme that came up at the end. So thank you for that. So special thanks to Katrina, Zifa, Caroline, Nathan, and Elizabeth for your illuminating presentations and wonderful insights and your lots of pearls of wisdom that you shared with us. And I'm sure that and we had a wave there from a Katrina member. And I'm sure the organizers of the meeting will make these resources available, hopefully. So Terry, I'll hand back to you for some closing comments.
Thank you very much. I think you've done a wonderful job. Thank you so much, Malcolm. You've done an amazing job as a moderator, and I really appreciate everything you've done. To our speakers, thank you as well for being here. But I also want to thank our organizing committee, which had members from University of Victoria, Simon Fraser University, UBC, UNBC, and UBCO, all were part of this organizing committee, and that helped us make these connections, because without those connections, we wouldn't have been able to meet you lovely people today. I'm thinking you all deserve your own podcast, and that's like just in my ear all the time, thinking, wow, we could listen to this a lot. This session is being recorded. It will be available on our website in a short little while. But thank you very much. And I'm just going to ask Jessica to please pop in the link to the survey. So for those that attended this afternoon and for those that attended this morning, please take a look at the survey. And if you're not coming back tomorrow, please fill out the survey today. But I'm really hoping that we'll see many of you again tomorrow at 9:30. So thank you once again. Bye.